evening.
How are we all doing?
Good.
Monday evening. Thank you all for making it out this evening. Welcome to Social Justice Week. We've had some panels already this afternoon, and Adam, Maurer, and I are keynote speakers, which is really exciting. So thank you for that. I would like to ask kindly if you feel comfortable to move on down. I know we're still in COVID, and if not, you can stay where you are. So for those that would like to come a little bit closer, just to make it a little bit more intimate, feel free to do so. If not, stay where you are, all right? Beautiful. Thank you, everybody.
For the grad student and just going first row.
And thank you for your patience with tech audio. Feel free to grab some food. There's always etiquette, right, at events and presentations. Adam and I are very, go with the flow.
Understand.
Yes, and adaptable.
Yes.
So. Let's get everybody comfortable. I'm not going to wear a mask just for now. I hope that's okay. We'll wait for one more. Thank you. I'm not calling anybody else yet. So this is going to be an interactive presentation. So really value input from all of you. So I'm going to ask you all to have your cell phones handy. And before we start, just would like for you to go to Mentimeter. That's MENTIMETER.com. And for those of you that are online, also get your cell phones ready. Mentimeter.com, and we'll provide the number with the questions that we have for tonight. So, yes, Mentimeter. It's MENTIMETER, and then period or dot com, C-O-M. All right. Okay. And before we get started, we're going to have Stacy do something.
Well, on behalf of the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, I'm supposed to welcome you all here and welcome our speakers who Jose has sort of introduced them for us. But then another task that I get to do before we begin is to read UWL's Indigenous Land Recognition Statement. So feel free to follow along on the screen. Follow along with Dana, but we would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples. Thank you. And so without further ado, Jose and Adam, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. So I always like to give a little bit of a overview of what we're going to be covering in the presentation. It'll be some formal and then also very informal with just a conversation with Adam and I. And Adam's going to be asking me questions. I'm going to be asking him questions.
Surprise, I'm much more informal than you.
Yes, yes. And also give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. Yeah. So why don't we actually do that?
Jump off that. So I'm Adam Maurer. I am genderqueer. I use him and her pronouns. I'm a sex positive therapist from Austin, Texas, and I do a lot of work in social justice. I've been working in therapy for almost a decade now. And I just love the opportunity to come and learn. And so I was like, oh, this will be so great because there's so much for me to learn just from José in this. I have all the questions. So I'm going to be channeling questions y'all have into my inability to understand things sometimes to be like, break it down for me, José. Help me get it. Help me understand what this can really mean. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will just say I'm no expert, but I know a few things, okay? So we're going to start out with just a little articles on environmental racism and injustice. One of them is from the Washington Post. The other one is from the Wisconsin Public Radio. We're going to talk about some of the definitions of what is environmental justice, or EJ, as it's commonly known, as well as what is environmental racism. We're also going to cover a little bit of racial segregation within planning and policy. That's going to be featured a little bit in the video that I think is a really great, not even precursor, but just introduction to an environmental justice and how it connects to social justice. Again, what is environmental justice? A little bit of the books that we're going to cover in the talk, and then a little bit of history of environmental justice and the segregation. We're not going to get too far in depth into it. How do we incorporate joy and pleasure in activism? You know, that's something that we typically don't really hear about, is when we engage in work that is related to equity, that's related to diversity, that's related to justice. Where is the passion? It's there. But do we talk about activism when it comes to joy, when it comes to pleasure, right? So that's a little bit of what we'll cover. And then the last thing will be, what can we do? Many people, when they attend talks like this, it's like, this is all really great information. So what do I do with it? What can I do? And then some acknowledgements. So here we go. Maybe. We'll just do this. Okay, so this article just came out a couple of weeks ago. For those of you online, this is the source, the Washington Post. And this is an article on Boyle Heights, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles. That has been that has changed, but also has not changed. And you read the headline here. It's really high up, but redlining, how it's affected and how it affects 45 million people. 50 years later, and I'll talk a little bit about what redlining is, but really Boyle Heights is a community that has traditionally been lived in by Latinx immigrants. There are other neighborhoods, of course, in Los Angeles. But Boyle Heights is very close to an industrial zoned area. So you see here, I'm not going to get too far into the article, but really want to highlight that the Washington Post, other newspapers are highlighting the effects of environmental racism and environmental justice to this day. So Boyle Heights, a heavily Latino area in Los Angeles, singled out for its detrimental racial elements, has one of the highest pollution scores in California. Now, why is this? Well, we're going to learn a little bit about why that is and how it continues to happen. Now, this is a California example, national example. And when we think about this here in Wisconsin, many of you, and many of you who may not know, what's happened right now with PFAS in La Crosse, and the investigation that's ongoing of the number of homes that were affected by PFAS, which is a chemical found in water that causes a lot of health problems, we'll say. And we'll share that in 2019, the State Department of Natural Resources ordered the city of La Crosse, okay, to investigate PFAS wells on French Island, where you flew in yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes. Officials believe that the chemicals that have been found in the water on French Island come from the use of firefighting foam in and around the airport, okay? In October, so this past October of 2021, the city notified 120 French Island households that they could be affected by the contamination and offered to test their private wells. Okay, so while many of these tests started coming back with some level of PFAS, residents on French Island started doing their own well testing, and so did the Department of Natural Resources here in Wisconsin. And what they found was that 533 private wells were tested on the island, and all but 12 had traces of PFAS, okay? So that's 31%, or 164 wells had PFAS levels that were deemed unsafe for drinking water by the State Department of Health Services. So many of us know, and we've heard over the last couple of years, what's happened with water. And there's a talk tomorrow on water, so check that out. Shameless plug. Thank you, Meredith. And have heard about it in Flint. We know what's happened with pipelines, right? Not just in Canada, into the United States. We heard about DAPA. We hear about other movements, about what's happening in Miami with flooding. What happened in Texas, which I would love to hear more about from you, Adam, in the freeze.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So not this year, but last year, we had a freeze in Texas, and that knocked out our power grid. And there was a number of people who did not have power for a week, because Texas is not made for the snowfall, if you didn't know. So we had people who didn't have water, who didn't have heat. We had hundreds of people die from a freeze.
Yeah. So when we think about environmental justice, it's not just happening in California, as we all know, Florida, Texas, it's happening right here in La Crosse. So I think that's always really important, because we always think that this is, in my opinion, somebody else's problem.
I was gonna say, Jose.
Right.
So there's like a tendency for people who maybe don't have to deal with these things like in their own life to be like, well, that's not for me, and I don't want to think about it, and it's sad, or it's hard. Like it can feel really easy to feel distant from it.
Yes.
And feel okay, but these are like human beings.
Yes.
So these are like people like us who are suffering.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's fascinating to me how easy it is to say, oh, well, it's not in front of me, I don't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's the environment, and we all have to deal with it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So now that you have a little bit of this context, okay, which I'm sure I'm stirring up some emotions, which is good, okay? In my opinion, if we stir up some emotions, that's good. And honor the emotions. Is I really want to get some feedback from all of you in regards to, and those are online as well, on some definitions. So we're going to use Mentimeter. So this is where your phones are going to come into play. And I'm going to just minimize this for now and pull up our Mentimeter. And I'm going to share this screen as well. Maybe. So the question is, what comes to mind when you think of environmental justice? Now that I've also given you a little bit of context. I'm going to share my screen maybe. Right here. Here it is. Okay. There we go. Okay. So what comes to mind when you think of environmental justice? Okay, sustainability is what we're saying. Reduce, reuse, recycle, I like that. Equity, equality, okay. Solidarity, okay, I like that a lot. Policy, okay. Wanting change, okay, yes, lots of change, definitely. Solidarity again. Equality, okay. Climate crisis, yes, we are in a climate crisis. Regardless of political opinion, we are in a climate crisis, we'll say, okay? Inclusiveness, I like that. These are all really positive, y'all. It's good. What else? Losing control, okay. I may ask some of you who are brave to just say a little bit more about some of the words that you've put in, okay? All right, so thank you everybody for sharing.
Jose, I'm curious if there's any that really stand out to you.
So the equitable zoning stands out to me. Thinking about zoning here in La Crosse and in other cities, and the role that zoning has in deciding and really determining what goes where. When we think about land use planning, when we think about where places are zoned for industrial, commercial, residencies, so equitable zoning really stands out to me. The losing control piece with just what's happening all over the world. Sustainability, that is a big word that's used all over, even within planning, other areas. Inclusiveness stands out for all kinds of reasons.
Oh, give me those reasons.
I mean, I think, what does it look like for us as a city, for us as a university to prioritize sustainability, to prioritize, I'll say, the quality of air, right, that we breathe, which the university did during COVID, but also of people, of housing. And we all know that there is a housing shortage, housing problem here in La Crosse. And not to be negative, but that's just the reality. So I think about inclusivity from all kinds of lenses. The other one that stands out to me is greedy corporations. And what happens, I'll say, when cities really allow and court developers to develop in a certain way in downtowns. So those are the ones that stand out to me. Yeah. So thank you everybody for participating. I'm going to stop the share and then re-share the PowerPoint. Okay. So I'm not going to read this to you all because many of you can read and many of you that are online can read. But what's important to know about environmental justice is that it's looked at from an intersectional lens. So as it says here, regardless of race, regardless of color, regardless of where you come from, regardless of your income, of how we look at development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So what does that mean? It's really, who are policymakers? What are they writing laws about? And how does that affect us where we are? And if you just break it down, environment, injustice, justice, many of the things that we described, right, in the Mentimeter, in really centering our environment to make things much more inclusive, okay? How do you see it? How do you define it, would you say?
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of awareness. So people, living in a capitalistic society, people like to consume because that's what we're like taught to do.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to consume without awareness, to take up space, and to continue that without any sort of connection to the impact that you're having on the environment and the chain of things.
Yeah.
So it's really easy. I mean, we're going to talk about the joy of it, but it's really easy to feel bummed out, to be like, oh man, I can't buy stuff. Like, what is that going to mean for me? Like, it's easy for folks, especially in American culture, who maybe have been told, like, this is your right to like live free and buy things.
Yeah.
To stop and hit pause and go, what does this really cost us? Right? What do these things really mean to us?
So the self-awareness piece is what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and how critical that is. Environmental racism, really coming from environmental justice, that looks at the practices and the ways that marginalized folks experience racism, right, and other kinds of marginalities. Really focuses on the economic inequalities and injustices, typically based on wealth, right, we know that, race, ethnicity, and I think the other one that is often left out is location, right? Geography and the role that plays in exacerbating environmental injustices, but also in environmental racism.
When we were talking about this last night, I was like, oh yeah, like we know where unchecked capitalism gets us. It's like children working in factories. And then I was like, oh wait, children still are working in factories. Yes. It's just not happening in our like viewpoint. It's not happening in America. So it's like, this is still going on, it's just removed.
Yes. And I think one concrete example for me, and you can share this with the crowd, is I brought up to him, what about diamonds, right? We like diamonds. And I forget who originally saying diamonds are whose best friend?
Adam's. Oh.
Yeah, Adam's best friend. Right.
You tried to read me for getting some diamonds, and I said, no, these are Gucci ones, first of all, A.
Yeah.
And B, they are responsibly sourced. And that is becoming, even in capitalism, like it's almost like a farce into itself.
Yes.
It's like, oh, we'll make sustainability and that like its own packaging, its own marketing.
Yes.
So there are responsibly sourced diamonds.
Yeah. I don't even know what that means, right? But that's a concrete example that I can think of. So a little bit of history with racial segregation and planning and policy. So this is where we're going to show the video. So I'm hoping that this works. Okay, so here we go.
Say a prayer to the God of your understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to turn it down. Sorry about that, y'all.
She works a little too well.
Let's see.
Who's praying so hard?
Okay, so this is a city. Here are all the people living in it. People of all different colors, ages, wealths, and incomes. Except they don't all live together in the same place. They're separated into different parts of the city by what color they are, what language they speak, and how much money they have. And those different parts of the city look quite different. The parts that are whiter and wealthier tend to have green spaces, grocery stores with nutritious organic food, and of course the money to buy it, and are often far away from pollution-emitting freeways. The parts that are poorer and more diverse tend to have industrial sites, heavy-duty diesel-polluted ports and highways, and hazardous waste, all things that the city relies on to run properly, but that heavily pollute the air and water. And even if they had those grocery stores with nutritious organic food, most residents there couldn't afford it anyway. How did this happen? Well, this segregation can be traced back to race-based zoning and housing policies, but it wasn't always as deliberate as plain old racism. Some separations can simply be traced to poor land use planning. And as a result, these residents of the same city live very different lives. Say the city realizes it has an emissions problem. It comes up with a plan to reduce air pollution, plant more trees to suck up the carbon, or start a cap-and-trade program. But those trees get planted in the neighborhoods that are already green, and the factories that are spewing toxins into the air just buy more carbon offsets and keep spewing their toxins. The benefits of these programs are enjoyed by the communities that are already doing just fine, and the communities that were hurting most from all that air pollution, well, they're still hurting. This isn't just an imaginary city. This is the story of real cities all across the U.S. where people might live in the very same area code, but their race, ethnicity, or wealth and income bracket causes them to experience wildly different quality of air, water, and life. In fact, it can even mean that they also experience different deaths. That's how serious this stuff is. This kind of inequity expands far beyond cities, too. Rural areas are full of commercially valuable resources like oil and coal, and they're also home to indigenous and low-income communities. But when those resources are extracted, those communities don't see any of the money, and they end up with all the air and water contamination that's left over from the extraction. And we even see this injustice on a global level, like in small island nations that are forced to directly confront the consequences of rising sea levels, but haven't played any significant role in the industries that are causing climate change. These peoples are sometimes forced to flee their homes because their land is literally going underwater. But the very states that did play a hand in creating climate change don't have migration policies to accommodate them. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about how we can try to break down and reimagine a system that's built up on these inequities. A system where those who are already disadvantaged because of their race and economic status are made poor because they're unable to profit from the resources that the world depends on, and are made sick or worse by the environmental contamination that comes with extracting those resources. Social inequities are intimately tied to the environment. That's why social justice is an environmental issue too.
Okay. So, another Mentimeter. So really want you to just think about your thoughts, emotions, feelings after watching this. Many of this is not new to you, but many and much of it maybe is. So would really just like to hear your reactions. So we're going to do another little Mentimeter. Stop the share. Let me share this one. Okay, so what comes up for you after seeing this short video, feelings and thoughts? The code is 8188-3310, especially for those of you that are online. And I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, my therapist perspective, I'm curious about is what it would take to include people who might reject some of these ideas, right? So some people might be resistant.
Yeah.
It really takes a level of curiosity to understand, what is it that is going on for them? Like genuine curiosity to be like, hey, I think you're a smart, caring person, and this is important to me, and I'm important to you. So let's have a conversation. What makes it hard for you to maybe understand some of this?
Yeah.
And how to use empathy and that sense of connection to better understand someone's perspective and use that to invite them to like join coming against some of these challenges.
Even if we agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what comes up? Frustration, need representation. Okay. Yeah. Inhumane. When will it stop? Why do we waste so much energy focusing on saving the turtles when this is happening?
The turtles got good marketing, man. They got astrology.
They
People
do.
said, not on my watch.
Yeah. Climate change want to be solved on climate change won't be solved under capitalism. Preach. Whoever said that, whether it's online or in here, yes. Representation in law and policy making, especially at the local level, is important. Yes, absolutely. Jerk politicians. Okay.
I mean, I come from where Ted Cruz is, but that's a special kind.
And it's moments like this, y'all, that I'm glad that I live here in Wisconsin is what I'll say, okay?
I mean, during our snowstorm, he went to Mexico and got caught.
Yeah, we all heard about that, right? Yeah. Uninformed, okay? Environmental regulations are not going to the geographic areas that they would actually benefit because of money. Yeah, yep. Privilege, as usual, okay, yeah.
It's like
Which
Scooby-
I want to talk more about that with you
It's like that
after the
Scooby-
sort of the formal presentation.
It's like that Scooby-Doo meme where you're like, reveal who it is. You're like, oh, it's privilege.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so infuriating that we constantly contribute to wreaking environmental havoc in other countries and then just leave and say it's not a problem. Ooh, a lot to unpack there. Okay. Yeah, a lot to unpack. Indigenous elders predicted this outcome. Yeah. Of what's happening, continues to happen. And repeated history. Okay. Why are we sacrificing lives for corporate greed? Woo! Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. If I didn't get to read one of these, I apologize. Okay. All right. So back at it. Let's see. Can we all see that? Yes. Okay. So these are some of the books that we're just briefly going to talk about. These are some books that I have, actually. I'm not going to pass two of them around because of COVID.
Oh, I thought usually because people have sticky fingers.
No. No. But maybe.
Both.
Yeah. He's the humor. I'm like, right? If you can't tell that by already. So the first one is Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good by Adrienne Marie Brown. So it's right here. The other one is The Body's Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. She talks a lot about the role of pleasure, the role of joy in body positivity, and how our bodies are not an apology. Adrienne Marie Brown talks a lot about pleasure activism. When we talk about activism in general, how can we find pleasure? How can we find joy in activism that we do? Both written by Black women. And then The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein, who looks at segregation that's happened within the United States, different planning policies, different laws that have been enacted and continue, I will say, to be enacted regarding segregation and really of where people live in different colors, which I won't get into. But these are just some books that really center our presentation. And just so you all know, Adam and I did an Instagram Live this past fall speaking about joy, speaking about activism, and speaking about pleasure.
And I am uniquely get this like fun perspective to talk about pleasure because part of my work is in sex therapy. And it's really fascinating to me. Like we have like the term like guilty pleasure. That's something that you should feel bad about, like something you have to hide. In American society in particular, there's an interesting like relationship with the term pleasure.
Yeah.
In doing sex therapy, sometimes I have people come in and they're like, oh, well, they never want it. And I'm like, what is it? And they can even feel comfortable talking about the pleasure that they are seeking in a physical sense.
Yeah.
So people have sometimes a really interesting relationship with pleasure that I'm excited for us to talk about.
Yes. Yeah. So a little bit of history to provide some context. So environmental justice traces its roots to the civil rights and social justice movements in the 1960s. If we think about the Chicana civil rights movement, the Indigenous civil rights movement, the civil rights movement, African-American students in Houston protested a city garbage dump in their community. Residents of Harlem is another example in New York City, joined together to fight a sewage treatment plant in their neighborhood. And the events set in Warren County, which I believe is North Carolina in 1982, really became a pivotal moment in the environmental justice movement. What I didn't mention so far is thinking about the different communities, right, that came together during the 1960s, the 1970s, into today that continue to fight for environmental justice and really calling out environmental racism. So that's just a really little tidbit of history. Madison, Wisconsin. This is a little bit of Richard Rothstein's work, but also maps in the city of Madison. I couldn't find one for the city of La Crosse. They have one for the city of Milwaukee, but I couldn't find one for the city of La Crosse. But the designated red areas that you see, and I'm going to see if I can point, are areas that are considered in Madison to not be, I'll say, habitable or really worth the property value. So that's why they were designated as red. The areas in yellow, the areas in blue. Also, so the green is where you want to live, right? So first grade. The blue, second grade. So not as good as green. Yellow, third grade. It's interesting, right, the hierarchy as well. So not as good as blue, but better than red. And then of course red. So this isn't new, and many of you have seen this before, but if you haven't, I encourage you to go online and start looking up maps of different cities in different plans. So this is from 1937. And we think about where places are, when we think about the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we think of where property values are, even here in La Crosse. And I said this, when we think about downtown, right, and Bell Square is the most dense building that we have in downtown. It takes up a whole city block. It's a beautiful building, right? It's mixed use, commercial on the first floor. It's apartments, it's offices. And then I ask a couple of questions, okay? $1,200, $1,300, okay? I don't know what the businesses pay. So what I ask myself when I visit cities, and when I was in Austin last year, when I was in Chicago just a little over a week ago, I asked myself these questions, and I encourage you to ask these questions to lead to self-reflection and a little bit more self-awareness. And they're, who belongs here, right? And who doesn't belong here? How does a city market itself? How does it publicize itself through housing, through its land use, through its zoning, through its accessibility, right? I'm glad that we have an interpreter here tonight. What does accessibility look like at the life scale, right? Not just for those that are infants, toddlers, kids, adults, but what about senior citizens? What does accessibility look like? Transportation. So who belongs here and who doesn't? So next time you go to the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Los Angeles, other places, Toronto, Canada, Miami, okay? Houston, Austin, Dallas. Who belongs here and who doesn't? And you will tell who belongs there and who doesn't.
It makes me think, I used to work in HIV, and so one of the trainings I went to was HIV and aging, and it looked at Manhattan. And if you look at, like, at the time, the number of deaths from HIV in Manhattan were pretty low. But you looked at, like, the other boroughs where there's more poverty, there's a lot more death because there's a lack of access just to care itself. Yeah. And it's amazing. Like, it's a disease that we have a way to treat. Yeah. And people just weren't able to get treatment. Yeah.
And still cannot get treatment, right? And not just for HIV, but other ailments and other illnesses, right? So who belongs in that city and who doesn't? Which may seem like it comes from a deficit mindset, but it's also very critical. The critical questions to ask: where we go, where we travel, right? That I'm asking myself more and more of, okay? So what I want us to remember, Adam and everybody else, is that this history is not our fault. It's not your fault, but it is our responsibility, right? To have self-awareness, yes, to be aware of our privileges, but that it's our collective responsibility to address the injustices, not just in the environment, but that we see around us. Thoughts on that?
It's fascinating because we were talking about this last night. You may not guess it by looking at me. I used to be very much in the God Squad. I was like an uber Christian and did missions trips. Yeah. And it's such a fascinating experience of people going, I want to do good, I want to support a community, and going in and really just doing more like tourism, right? So not working with the community, not talking to people who know where the resources are, not considering what they truly need, and taking a selfie and being like, oh, I am good. So I think it's interesting to think about it from the perspective of, like, what does actual, like, support look like for community, rather than kind of environmental tourism mixed with, like, I'm a good person because look at me.
Yeah. That's a lot.
I don't feel like she was a Christian. Yeah.
So this is where it gets a little bit more informal. How do we incorporate joy? How do we incorporate pleasure in the activism? So these two questions. How can we begin to incorporate more joy and pleasure through activism? And how have we incorporated joy and pleasure in our activism in our own lives, if at all? And this is where the interaction from those that are in attendance physically, I didn't create a Mentimeter for this, so I apologize. But I'm going to ask you these questions. Okay. How do you incorporate joy and pleasure in the activism that you do, and the work that you do?
One of my favorite things about being a person and doing relationship work is when you have a common enemy, it makes you fast friends. So being able to come together as community and be like, great, what does it mean for us, and how do we encourage and inspire and support each other? And not just for the mission that we might be, like, moving towards, but also just in our daily lives. Yeah. So what is it to show up and to care for each other?
Yeah. And what's that often common enemy that you see and hear about?
Capitalism is usually in the mix.
Okay.
Systems of oppression.
Yeah.
So in my world, homophobia, transphobia, all the phobias. And it's really about how do we, not, because part of the pleasure is it gives you fuel to keep going. Like if we just take the first half of this conversation and go home, we're all gonna be crying in our cars. Like it's not, it doesn't feel great.
Yeah.
And so, and it's okay, it doesn't feel great, but it's like, it feels hopeless.
Yeah.
So it's this ability to go, all right, what can we do that's like really meaningful?
Yeah.
And in relationship work, when I do people in session, oftentimes they come in and they say, this is all the things wrong with this person, right? And they can just name it. They can just be like, they do this wrong, this wrong, this. And I'm like, cool, what do you think you're really longing for? When do you catch them doing right? What is it like when you get the things that you want? So focusing on the things that you're longing for, that you want, make it easier to move towards that. It makes it easier then too from a mindset. So if I think, hey, we can work together and have joy in figuring this out, that mindset makes it easier as we do the labor together. Everybody's like, oh, we're just sick to this thing, and I think this talk, and like I'm supposed to be Captain Planet now or whatever. Like it's not going to be good. It's going to be, it's going to feel crummy, and it's going to feel difficult to continue the labor.
Yeah. How have you incorporated joy and pleasure in the activism in your own life?
Oh, well, I mean, some of us have it thrust upon us because we can't tell I'm very fabulous. So that takes a lot of me just existing. And if I could easily get bitter, right? It's easy to get bitter and mad at the world, especially because we see the oppression. But there's so much joy in the liberation on the other side. I think about, there are times where I consider where I've come from and how far I've grown as an individual, and I'm all like, oh, that's gorgeous.
Yeah. Say a little bit more about liberation.
Oh, we want to talk about liberation.
Yeah.
Liberation is a little bit different, right? Like there's this ability. So I think of freedom as like something that is given to you, right? So you're locked up and someone comes and locks the cage for you. Nice. But liberation is like when you go, oh, I can just get out of this cage myself. Mm-hmm. How do I like break down the system that is trying to keep me locked up? And the okayness to do that.
How do we allow ourselves, and how can we give ourselves permission to experience joy, to experience pleasure in activism?
Ooh, so we're just talking about experiencing pleasure first.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, y'all.
Yep.
So here is an assignment I'm going to give you. Ready? We're not going to do it here. You're going to do it later on this week. I want you to give yourself permission to get your favorite meal or beverage and get someone you feel comfortable with. So a friend, a frisky friend, an insignificant other, a partner, whomever. And I want you to practice just allowing yourself to be seen while you have that joy of that meal or that beverage. And let it be heard, let it be seen. And just be curious with yourself as you do it, because it's like, it can feel really awkward, right? To sit there and be like, oh my goodness, it's so delicious. And it's like, why do I feel anxious about expressing the joy, the pleasure that I'm feeling as I go about this?
Yep.
Right? I can hear some laughing, I was like, ooh, it does, right? It just feels a little silly. It's like, just because like I have a cup of coffee, but it's that intentional connection. And that's one of the reasons I really love pleasure. Because I think of pleasure as like intentionally connecting with something. Yeah. Now, Jose.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask you a question.
Yeah. Table's turn.
Yes, ma'am. So it's easy in spaces outside of here where we are not presenting to be like, white people, what do we do with this? But because you're here and more of an expert on this, what can I do about these challenges? What can I do to help support?
Yeah.
Oof, yeah.
That's a loaded question.
I know.
I'm not an expert, so I don't like that title.
Yeah.
Okay. What I will
more
say,
knowledgeable.
More knowledgeable, there we go. What I will say is self-awareness is important, right? Awareness of different privileges that we all have is important. But something as simple as for students that are online and students that are here, Passing the mic. Now, what does it look like for folks who have traditionally been marginalized to speak up first? And if you have a dominant identity, what does it look like for you to speak last? That's one example. The importance of therapy. We have a therapist in the house. And what I mean by that is really the importance of self-work, right? For many of us, including myself, unpack many of the traumas that we have experienced. Environmental justice, environmental racism is linked to that. But what does it look like for us to give ourselves permission to feel, right? The emotions, the joy, the pleasure in therapy, in doing that self-work. And I recognize that not everybody has that access, right? And that I'm speaking from a privileged standpoint. But passing the mic, self-awareness, doing the work on yourself, and like in that discomfort that many of us feel is something that's maybe unknown, that we don't know about. Statistics is not my area, okay? Curiosity. Tell me more about that, right? Say more. That's what if you know me, I love to say when people talk and I'm curious, I would say more. So those are some ways. Now that's not going to change what's happening in the environment.
It did make me think of something.
Yeah.
So I think about, like, I get to have white privilege because I am very white. If you didn't know, flour was a spice in my house.
Yeah.
So with that, it's very isolating because to maintain it, to hold on to that privilege, you have to not be connected to people, because if you are, then you hear like, hey, your privilege is like hurting me, and I need you to like take action, please and thank you.
Yeah.
So it creates this like isolation, and from my perspective, it makes it easier then to align with the capitalism of like, oh, that's happening over there, and you know, people should just do something about it, but not me, because I'm not really in that community. I'm not really connected.
Yeah. So it's a good segue.
Woo!
Segue into, so what can we do ourselves? But I'm curious, from many of you, how can you begin to incorporate more joy and pleasure through activism? And how have you incorporated, if at all, this activism in your own lives? And who is going to be a brave soul from the physical audience?
Because Jose knows I'll pick somebody.
Yeah.
And we've already made eye contact with her. Thank you.
Okay. So I think something that I've always struggled with is like finding community. And I think growing up, you know, in a very white-dominated, conservative area, it's really easy to feel isolated in what you're thinking and what you're feeling and your thoughts. And so I think finding that community and like finding a group of people that, you know, have similar values and have similar thoughts, because so many of us are like from families, you know, that may not be supportive, from environments that may not be supportive. So finding that support in different ways, I think, and just the people, I think, really is something that brings me joy, and I didn't realize brought me a lot of joy until recently. So,
sense of community. Yeah. Thank you, Margaret.
Can I piggyback on that? It makes me think, I'm very fortunate. I have a very big old community in Austin that's sex positive and queer, and it, you know, in those communities, it is diverse, and it pushes you to like have deeper relationships and connections to be able to maintain that. And there's this level of like joy and liberation and seeing multiple ways to exist.
Yeah.
And to move from like, there's this very narrow pathway of what is acceptable to like, there's a million ways to be on this planet. And they can all be enjoyable and desirable. What works for me, right? So seeing me here today with purple hair, it can be easy to be like, well, that's not professional, right? But it brings me joy.
Yeah.
And it lets people know it's okay to talk to me about certain things, right? Like as a sex therapist, we're like, we know what we can talk about. And so it's exciting to find somebody like, oh, I see you. I get a glimmer of who you are. I get that way when I walk into a space where there's other queer people. I don't know if anyone else is here is queer today. I know one person is.
Yeah.
But like it's just so, it's like, oh, we see, and I feel seen. And that's really lovely. Oh.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Wait. Nope, we're not going to forget about you.
Yes.
I feel bad. I'm a teacher, so I know the eye contact thing. But I feel like more recently I've just been like, everything is doom and gloom and everything is trash and nothing's ever gonna be better. But I think, not to like, kind of say the answer, but I think it's like the people that I get to work with and my friends and the people that like, do have similar ideas and stuff, where you can just like even learn more from them. Like I teach them something and they teach me, is like that builds our relationship, and I'm very like relationship and people focused. And so anytime that we can have a stronger conversation that strengthens that is really important to me and brings me joy. I
love it. I also love too, in recognizing privilege, the okayness to give people who are marginalized, like, hey, I can actually be a supporter. Like getting all this together, José is very like, I got this, and like everything. I was like, hey, I can pay for the parking. Like, if you want to go get that together, I can do something. And he was like, oh, I guess you can. I was like, yeah, the okayness to show up for each other. You were gonna say something.
Jazz. Yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna say that so I'm speaking a little bit louder for the microphone.
Yeah.
But for me, I try to show up as my like true authentic self, especially when I'm interacting with like young people, so like youth and whatnot, because especially being in like a town like Crosse, with it being predominantly white and whatnot, I think sometimes our young people feel like they can't, like they have to put on like this facade and and like that whole code switching kind of thing that goes on. But when I interact with them, I want them to know like, hey, you can be yourself. Like this is a space where you can let your hair down and just enjoy and have pleasure in knowing that like you're in a community where you are accepted, you're not seen as different for whatever kind of reason, and then we all just leave having a good time. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jess. So what can you or I do leads me to the next one. So many of us are educators here. We're in higher education. So I thought it very fitting to include the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. I had never heard about this. I was like, that's a thing? Okay. It's an organization? Yes, it is. So this is what they have incorporated when it talks about racial equity, social justice, sustainability. So learning, right? Being curious, defining racism. Okay, that's important. Discussing with other students, with classmates, with colleagues on ways to combat racism. Examine a policy through a racial equity and social justice lens, right? That's important. So thank you for all our professors, educators, for challenging us and asking us critical questions. Adam, what you said, self-awareness, right? Recognizing our own privileges. Questioning. You can question the content of this presentation. It's okay. We're grown. We can take feedback.
That's how it gets better.
Huh?
That's how it gets better.
Yes. Yes. Scheduling a meeting with senior leaders, right, to understand opportunities for BIPOC individuals, environmental justice on campus. We have the Green Fund. We have the Environmental Studies minor here on campus. There's several faculty who are here in person that you can talk to. You can also look up online. There's a lot also happening in the La Crosse community. Speaking out, right? That's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It did make me think of something.
Yeah.
So I'm someone who gets to hold space for people in therapy all the time,
Yeah.
right? And I'm really well-meaning. I want my clients to feel good. I also have privilege. And part of like owning it to me is just telling people like, hey, I'm gonna flop, I'm gonna miss something, or I come from a system that inherently has made me ignore some things or act in ways. And when I do, you have the okay to tell me. And my job's gonna be to understand, like connect with you, take my part, and then level up. So I think it was like calling someone in, which is a really beautiful way to be. Like that is how we get better as a whole. When I have like straight or cis people, Lord, they a mess, flub with me, I don't want them to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, because then I'm like, their discomfort becomes the center, right? And not my harm. Instead, I want them to be like, ah, it's dope, dude. Thank you for teaching me. Like, I'm gonna learn some more. Here's maybe some money for your labor if I had to teach them a little something. Because Gucci ain't free, y'all. You know what I'm saying? But like, right, like it can be a way to lift each other up. Like, there's joy in that. There's joy in expanding in that way. So I just wanted to make sure that was noted.
Can you talk a little bit more about calling people in rather than people calling out?
Ooh, we're talking about
Please.
that.
Teresa's shaking her head.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I see it like this. Because there's so much injustice in the world, there are times where something goes awry and people are like, yes, now's the chance. I can bring all this justice that I've been longing for to this moment, to this person. And, you know, some people, they have done some pretty heinous things, and I get why there's like such a heap on that. And there's, to me, this nuance of like, who is a good candidate to level up? So if in the community, the moment you flub, you are done, we're not going to have any sort of community because we're all going to flub. So rather, I'm like, who's a good investment of my time and energy to level up? And sometimes that might mean saying, hey, here is like what's up that hurt. What can you do to like do that? Oh, shoot, you know what? I'm going to go like to therapy for a little bit and talk about it and get back to you. I'm going to read this book on this topic and get back to you. Other times I might be able to like help that person. Depends how like hurt I feel. And not that it's on me as like a queer person to like get the straight person collected, but it is, if it's a relationship I see potential for, it's one I'm going to nurture. And there's something about nurturing that. It's really beautiful too. Like, I don't know if y'all have ever been on the receiving end of forgiveness. And that really not only like is, I was going to say soul, but that's not me. It's really just the kindest, warmest thing you can feel. Because we all know we can like, we all know we have flubbed. We all know we messed up. And it encourages us to give us our own selves that, which gives us then more ability to show up and have community. Whew, emotional.
Wow. Yeah. And then the last one, and there's many others, and sort of what I said about not just passing the mic, but who doesn't have a seat at the table, right? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Because I was just talking about it today.
Yes. Yeah.
So, you know, here's the tea from my perspective.
Okay. Spill the tea, Adam. Spill the tea.
If marginalized people in your life who you have privilege aren't talking about their marginalization with you, they're probably not friends, they're more acquaintances because they don't feel like they can talk about that with you if you don't invite them to. And when that happens, right, then there comes a time for a project or a presentation, and people usually think about who they're friends with. And this is what I see happen a lot. So there's a lot of well-meaning people who are like together, and then as the project like builds, they're like, oh shoot, we don't have diversity. we didn't consider any of that. And they just sprinkle it on top, right? So this table that's not even built for this person, we try to like put them in the corner and be like, great, even though they don't have access to like their voice in it, they didn't help from the ground up, which would be really like guiding the project, helping it grow. So it's this afterthought that happens when people don't make it okay to talk about privilege, don't make it okay for people to come in and have that conversation.
Yeah.
Which, you know, hurts everyone because it gives us this limited product where when we really value inclusiveness, we really value all the perspectives that are available, man, we can like do so much more.
Yeah. Preach.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, not that, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what can you do? We all have phones, or most of us, I will say. These are just some folks who are doing work. They're through Instagram. They are Black, Indigenous people of color. We also have several professors on campus, so I encourage you to go to the Environmental Justice Minor landing page here at UWL and look to see with some of the folks on campus who are doing the work in the community. Be conscientious of what you consume, right? We all consume every day, right? Food, media, social media. What does that look like? I don't think it's going to end environmental racism, right? But the awareness piece in following, right? Not just people of color, but others who are doing the work is important. So one of them is Jerome Foster, not a local activist, but what he's doing in learning a little bit more about inequality in different areas. So there's this website that has interactive maps that you can see in the US that looks at the different colors. So the best, green, as I had mentioned before, B is still desirable is the way that they have it. C, definitely declining. D, hazardous. So again, it's that curiosity, it's that learning piece. What other ways would you suggest, based on your lens as a therapist and in the work that you've done, that not just focuses on justice, environmental justice, but really liberation work that you do?
I think one, like most people here, because you care about things, you're a caring person, giving yourself the okayness to take a beat sometimes, take a break. And I think that's hard to do, to go like, sometimes I might need my community to carry like things in this moment.
Yeah.
To give yourself rest and see rest as like pleasure. Because it's a long, long time to be doing this work.
Yeah.
And it's gonna take all we got. And sometimes you can't be the one doing labor, and that's okay. But doing it with intention, communicating that, having a community, again, it lets you tag out for a bit, and people can step up in meaningful ways. One of the things I'm like a big advocate for is the platinum rule. Do y'all know the platinum rule? Okay.
I don't know what the platinum rule is.
So the golden rule is trash, right? Because the golden rule says treat people as you want to be treated. But what is loving and caring to you may not be loving and caring to me, right? So if I tell my grandma something's going down, she'll be like, oh, sugar, I'll pray for you. I'll be like, can you make a sandwich while you say that prayer?
Yeah.
Because that's going to feel more meaningful. So the platinum rule is to treat people the way they request to be treated. Hey, I see you struggling. What can I do to be a support to you? Right? I could talk about it with you or not talk about it with you. As a therapist, it sounds weird to have me say, hey, not everyone needs to talk about everything. Sometimes people don't want to talk about what's going on and they just need rest. Woo. We got some goblins up in here.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just need rest. Sometimes maybe they need a break from it and they just want to play a video game with you. Sometimes they just want a sandwich. And in that, right, when you move towards the platinum rule, I think the reason some people have a struggle with that is because it decenters them, right? So the golden rule is like, I'm showing up for you. Look how great I am. The platinum rule is like, oh, you just need a nap. I can help you get a nap.
Yeah.
Like, you want me to watch your kids for 2 hours and you take a nap? You get some rest? Dope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Me too.
Yeah.
That's why I said it.
Yes, thank you. So to be mindful of time, want to really just recognize those that made it possible for us to present and to be here. So the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, the Center for Transformative Justice, the Institute for Social Justice. I will say that I couldn't find a logo for ISJ. I think this one's from a couple years ago. Just calling in, not calling out, okay? Green Fund in each of you.
Yeah, viewers like you.
Viewers like you, yes, PBS. So thanks for coming to the presentation, really to our talk. and for participating events for Social Justice Week. Those are my social media and my website. And then
Yeah, the easiest way to get to me is Moon Tower Counseling on Instagram, or you can find me on Christian Mingle.
facetious.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And that's it.
Yeah.
Questions, if any,
Can I do a really,
concerns, complaints.
can I do a really quick duty too? Adam and Jose, we want to thank you so much for the presentation. Before you take questions, this is a gift on behalf of the Division of Diversity and Inclusion.
You're going to make a lady cry. Thank you.
You're very
kind of
welcome.
you.
So thank you very much.
Woo!
And thank you everybody online as well for tuning in this Monday night. Have a good rest of the semester. Yeah.
So we got questions.
Yes, questions.
You got questions, we got answers.
Possible answers.
I got answers.
Possible answers.
Meaning of life? Got you. Yeah.
So how long have you been doing this, like sex counseling?
Oh my goodness.
Therapy.
Yeah.
I want a little bit of that story.
I love it. So I'm very fortunate, y'all. Sex therapy actually saved my life. So as a queer person, I had learned to like hate myself because that's what we teach folks. And in that, it was a really challenging thing. And I was fortunate enough when I was an undergrad to find the counseling center. And, you know, Megan, who was my counselor then, did not realize what she was setting in motion. So she had me do this activity where I had to put on the outside of the box what I show to the world, what I project, and on the inside, what I hide. And in that, that's how I came out to myself. And it wasn't until like a little bit later on when I was like doing some work in a rehab, I was like, oh, I think counseling's for me. And working with queer people, you're going to be working in sex. That's just it, right? Because once you challenge one of the preconceived notions of how to be on this planet, you start to challenge all the other ones. So you're like, okay, well, if I'm not straight and maybe my sexuality is more fluid or I'm gay or bi or what have you, what do I think about kink? What do I think about relationships that are more than monogamous? And all of a sudden you start questioning like all these preconceived notions. So when I started like my counseling practice back in 2013, people would show up and they would want to talk about sex, right? Especially relationship work. Usually in relationship work, you have someone who's like, I don't want to go to counseling, which I get, right? Because people with a main squeeze tend to pick someone that compliments them. So one person's like, counseling, heck yeah. And the other person's like, talking to a person about feelings, that sounds like terribleness. But once sex isn't happening, that's when people come in. And so I was like, Joe, this is great. And I could see all the liberation that came for people who were experiencing pleasure. And so from that lens, I started to go, okay, this could actually be a support to mental health. So, you know, traditionally, what you might hear is like people pathologizing sexual behavior. So if someone is like masturbating to porn or having solo sex or having like lots of sex, it's seen as like an issue because it's from this like sex negative limited perspective. And what I get to do, what I love about sex therapy, is I'm like, cool, what could your sexuality do for you? How could it help you? How does it help you cope? So I have clients who it helps them like sleep, right? So they might like pull out their vibrator and be like, oh, it helps me like focus, be in myself, have that pleasure, and kind of let the day go. I'm like, great, I can like encourage you to do that. I have folks who have depression or anxiety, and their sex positive spaces, like a kink community, gives them connection, community. It gives them the ability to communicate what's going on inside of them. Because in a scene, you have to negotiate, like, oh, what do I want? So it makes you like pause and go, who am I? What am I about? What's going on with me? And it brings that awareness that we were talking about. So yeah, a long time, almost 10 years.
I'm gonna stop the share.
Any other questions?
Like how you pointed out rest as a form of pleasure, and I was thinking about how we can sustain things so much better, like a choir, if we take a breath while the rest of the community keeps singing, and we kind of alternate when we take our breath. Do you have any suggestions of how to encourage people to come back in after they've had their rest or how to like synchronize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I love the idea, like I work with a lot of people who are new parents. And you were talking about like no rest, new parents. It's going to sound silly, but it's really all about intentionality. So when people can go, okay, I can intentionally take like this time to rest and turn off everything, it's easier to plug back in. Sometimes people, this is what I hear a lot about, is someone's like, okay, I'm going to go to bed, and one person will go like straight to bed, and the other person's like finishing up the laundry and like putting something else away. Like they aren't turning off in the same way. And so it's the okayness to go, hey, intentionally, we are going to power down. I'm going to power down. Here's when I can come back online, and this is where we can have this handoff. And to me, it's more about the relationships with people. Because if I care about you, I want you to have rest. I want you to have the pleasure of that. And it's going to help not only you, but it's going to help me in our relationship. And then if we have a family system, it's going to help that family system. So when people have like kids, I'm like, dope, there's like 3 yous now. So you have individual self, you have your relationship self, and then you have your family self. And all 3 of those arenas need attention. And if that doesn't happen, then things are going to get cattywampus. It's going to get a little tough. So sometimes people spend too much time working. Sometimes people spend too much time in parent mode, and sometimes people spend too much time in couple mode. And some element is going to get not enough attention. So you got to spin those plates with intention.
Intentionality. Yeah.
These are beautiful. Jazz, you got a question. Am I wrong? She's like, why am I saying
No, she's calling you out, not calling you in.
No, I don't have a question.
Yes.
How about the pleasure of a job well done, right? I hear professional pride in what you talk about. And I think maybe we can talk about that for environmentalism too, and sort of getting involved in environmental justice and other aspects of that, like expertise you bring to a problem, you know, for teaching, I think about self-efficacy and like helping students develop the confidence that they can do something. I don't know, do you see a parallel with your work and that?
Yeah, it's building in that momentum. So sometimes, you know, when we look at a task, if the goal keeps moving, if it gets too complex, we can have trauma reactions kick in. And so if I'm thinking like, oh gosh, this is all too big and too much, I might power down. I'm a power down person. So I kind of like get sleepy and like go. Some people run, some people fight, whatever. But so what you have to do is then go, oh, okay, I have to like move the goalpost. So now the goalpost is not like this major thing that's gonna like be too long, too far out for me to get to. It's this like immediate, like small goal. And if I just focus on that, if I recalibrate the goal, then it's easier to keep going. It's easier to maintain. And you build on that momentum with like little things. So I have clients think about like break down things in like 3 tiers. There's like easy goals, right? Like brush your teeth today. There's like medium grade goals, which is like eat 3 hots. Eat 3 hot meals. And there's maybe like the bigger goal of like, okay, you have to like, you know, go to work or whatever. And so sometimes it's like, dope, if you do a bunch of the little ones, you can start to build that momentum to take on a medium-sized goal, a big goal. And use that momentum, use that hit of dopamine to keep going. Yeah.
I think we need that really badly sometimes for environmental advocacy because the problems are so big. So I think that's a really wise sort of perspective to bring to that.
Yeah. So it makes it interesting because I like clown on the turtles, but I'm also like, what a small thing, but people are like, that's happening. And now it is much more common to see like metal straws or silicone straws for people. I'm like, wow, those turtles really got good marketing. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. How are you doing? I'm feeling much better.